Welcome to Dreamy Tales, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Tonight, prepare yourself for a journey into darkness as we explore the most chilling tales that linger in the corners of our minds. The Whispering Room. It started with a job offer. Emma had been scrolling through an online job board late one night, desperate to find anything to keep her afloat. Among the endless ads, one caught her eye. Caretaker needed for estate upkeep. Isolated property. High pay. Immediate start. She applied, not expecting much. But within an hour, her phone buzzed. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "We need someone who can handle solitude," the man said. His tone was polite, but there was something off about it, detached, almost rehearsed. "The house has peculiarities. If you're interested, come by tomorrow." The next day, Emma arrived at the estate. The house stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by dense woods. It was massive, ancient, the kind of place that seemed to breathe on its own. A man greeted her at the door. He was old, his face worn, and his eyes avoided hers. Without much conversation, he handed her a single, rusted key and a folded piece of paper. The instructions were scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Don't go into the Whispering Room after sunset," he said. His voice dropped, as if the walls might overhear him. "No matter what you hear." Emma forced a nervous laugh, but the man didn't respond. He just turned and walked away. That first day passed quietly enough. Emma cleaned and explored the house, marveling at its eerie charm. Every corner held something strange: a faded portrait, a dusty book, a chair that seemed placed just wrong. At the top of the grand staircase, she found it, the locked door. The faded brass plaque read, "Whispering Room." She stared at it, curious. But the man's warning echoed in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a faint sound, like the murmur of distant voices. At first, she thought it was the wind. But then, the voices grew clearer. Emma sat up, straining to listen. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something insistent about them. Something that made her skin crawl. She turned on every light in her room, pulled the covers over her head, and prayed for morning. The second day was harder. She tried to keep busy, scrubbing floors, dusting shelves, anything to distract herself. But by sunset, her eyes kept drifting toward the staircase. The whispers had returned, louder this time. As the hours dragged on, the temptation grew unbearable. She found herself standing outside the door, the key in her hand, trembling. She pressed her ear to the wood. "Emma, come closer." Her breath caught. She stumbled back, dropping the key as if it had burned her. She ran to her room, locked the door, and didn't sleep a second that night. By the third night, she couldn't resist. The whispers were louder now, almost pleading. Heart pounding, she slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadow. Her flashlight beam danced across peeling wallpaper and dark stains that marred the floor. The air was thick, suffocating. In the center of the room stood a chair, facing a cracked mirror. Emma stepped inside. The voices were everywhere now, overlapping, rising, and falling like waves. Closer, they urged. See for yourself. Her flashlight shook as she approached the chair. The mirror wasn't normal. The grime-covered glass reflected her, but something was wrong. The figure in the mirror smiled. Emma wasn't smiling. The reflection's eyes were hollow, its grin stretched too wide. And then, it moved. It raised a hand to the glass. Emma screamed, stumbling back. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. When the door creaked open again, Emma stumbled out. She was alive, but something had changed. Her steps felt heavy. Her thoughts, slower. She made her way to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and looked into the mirror. Her reflection stared back. It smiled. But Emma wasn't smiling. The next day, a new caretaker arrived at the estate. On the kitchen table, they found a single piece of paper. The instructions were written in messy, shaky handwriting. Don't go into the whispering room after sunset. The Lantern Keeper. There's a town deep in the valley, surrounded by dense woods, where the nights are darker than anywhere else in the world. The locals call it the Hollow. It's not on any map, and visitors don't tend to stay long. The Hollow has one rule: never follow the lantern light. Most people don't question it. The darkness itself is terrifying enough, and the idea of wandering into the woods after sundown? Unthinkable. But if you were to step outside on a moonless night, you'd see it just beyond the tree line. A single, flickering lantern, swaying gently in the distance. Mia arrived in the Hollow just after sunset. She was a photographer, always looking for hidden places and untold stories. The town's mystery intrigued her, the kind of intrigue that had made her career. She planned to stay for a week, take her pictures, and uncover the secrets no one dared to talk about. Her first night in the rented cottage was quiet, almost peaceful. She unpacked her camera gear, brewed some tea, and watched the stars through the tiny kitchen window. But just as she was about to head to bed, she saw it. The lantern. It hung low in the distance, swaying like a cradle in the wind. It was mesmerizing. She grabbed her camera instinctively. A shot like that, glowing softly against the pitch-black trees, would be perfect for her portfolio. But something stopped her. A sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint whisper, carried on the breeze. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A warning. Mia shivered and closed the curtains, trying to ignore the chill that ran down her spine. The next morning, she asked the locals about the lantern. An older man at the diner paused, mid-bite, and set down his fork. "You're not thinking about following it, are you?" he asked. Mia laughed nervously. "I mean, no. Of course not. But someone must be carrying it, right? A lantern doesn't move on its own." He leaned closer, his eyes grave. "It's not a person, if that's what you're asking. No one knows who or what the Lantern Keeper is. But we know what it does. It lures you. Makes you see what you want to see. And when you follow, you don't come back. Mia nodded, but her curiosity was only growing. She had to know more. That night, the lantern appeared again. This time, it was closer. Mia tried to ignore it, but the way it moved was hypnotic. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, beckoning her. And then she heard it. A voice. It wasn't a faint whisper from the night before. This was clearer, sharper, like someone was standing just outside her window. Mia. Her name. She froze, her heart racing. Who's there? She called out, but the only answer was silence. She grabbed her flashlight and her camera. She told herself it was just a photograph. That's all. She wasn't going far. The woods swallowed her in an instant. The air was cold, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. The lantern was further than it had seemed, always just out of reach. Her flashlight flickered. She stopped, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. She raised her camera, snapping a few photos of the lantern in the distance. The flash lit up the trees, but when the images appeared on her screen, there was no lantern. Only shadows. Her heart sank, and for the first time, she thought about turning back. But then, just beyond the glow of the lantern, she saw it, a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked like a child. "Hey," she called out, moving closer. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. As she approached, her flashlight flickered again and went out completely. The lantern's glow was the only thing guiding her now. She was close enough to see the figure clearly, a little boy, no older than 10, dressed in clothes that looked decades out of place. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "Are you hurt?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy slowly raised his arm, pointing behind her. Mia turned, but there was nothing. Just darkness. When she looked back, the boy was gone. The lantern moved again, faster this time, darting deeper into the woods. Against all logic, Mia followed. The air grew colder. Her breaths came in shallow gasps. The whispers returned, louder now, circling her. "You shouldn't have come." She stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling well. The lantern hung above it, suspended by a rusted chain. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Mia stepped closer, her feet moving on their own. The light of the lantern bathed her in a sickly glow. She peered into the well, her camera hanging limply at her side. A face stared back. It wasn't hers. The next morning, the locals found her camera lying at the edge of the woods. The photos were still intact. The last image showed the well, with the lantern glowing faintly above it. And just behind the well, barely visible in the shadows, was the boy. His glassy eyes stared directly at the camera. And in his hand, a lantern. The last passenger. It was nearly midnight when Claire boarded the last bus out of the city. The station was deserted, save for a few flickering lights and a stray cat weaving through the benches. Claire clutched her backpack tightly, exhaustion tugging at her as she stepped onto the dimly lit bus. The driver, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, didn't look up from his newspaper. He simply gestured to the rows of empty seats. "You're the only passenger tonight," he said, his voice flat and monotone. Claire nodded, sliding into a seat near the middle. She always liked to sit by the window, watching the city lights fade into darkness as they passed. The doors hissed shut, and the bus lurched forward. At first, it was peaceful. The hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires were almost soothing. Claire leaned her head against the window, watching the rain begin to splatter against the glass. She hadn't slept much in days, and her eyes grew heavy. But just as she was about to drift off, she felt a presence. Turning her head, she froze. A man was sitting across the aisle from her. She was certain the bus had been empty when they left the station. She hadn't heard the bus stop or the doors open. The man was hunched over, his face obscured by the brim of an old, tattered hat. He wore a dark coat that looked damp, as though he'd been caught in the rain. Claire tried not to stare, but something about him felt wrong. The bus continued its journey, the city fading into an endless stretch of highway. The rain fell harder now, the sound of it drumming against the roof. The man didn't move. Claire glanced at the driver, who seemed oblivious, his eyes fixed on the road. She considered asking him about the stranger but felt foolish. Maybe she'd just missed him getting on. Shaking her head, she tried to relax, telling herself she was overthinking. But then, the man turned his head. His face was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes sunken and hollow seemed to pierce right through her. "Isn't it late for traveling alone?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Claire's throat tightened. She forced a weak smile. I guess." The man's lips curled into a faint grin, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the kind of smile you give when you know something the other person doesn't. The bus hit a bump, jolting Claire out of her thoughts. She realized the man was no longer sitting across the aisle. Her heart raced as she looked around. He was gone. The seat was empty, as though he'd never been there. Claire gripped the edge of her seat, her mind racing. Had she imagined him? The exhaustion must have been getting to her. She leaned forward to call out to the driver. "Hey, did you see?" But before she could finish, she heard it. A faint whisper. It came from behind her. Slowly, Claire turned her head. The man was there again, seated in the very last row. His hat was tilted forward, obscuring his face. The whispering grew louder, though his lips weren't moving. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, echoing in a language she didn't understand. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice shaking as she turned back toward the driver. "There's someone back here." The bus screeched to a halt. The driver finally looked at her, his expression grim. "Miss, there's no one else on this bus." Claire's blood ran cold. She glanced back again, but the last row was empty. The driver pulled the bus back onto the road, muttering something under his breath. Claire sank into her seat, her heart pounding. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, refusing to look back again. But the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, wrapping around her like a cold wind. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it was inside her head now, crawling through her thoughts. "Stop the bus," she screamed. The driver slammed the brakes. "What is it?" he barked, turning around. But before she could answer, the lights on the bus flickered, and went out. The darkness was suffocating. The hum of the engine died, leaving only the sound of the rain. Claire could hear the driver fumbling with something up front, cursing under his breath. And then, she heard footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They came from the back of the bus, moving closer. "Who's there?" Claire demanded, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped just behind her seat. She felt the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. A hand rested on her shoulder. She screamed, scrambling out of her seat and running toward the driver. "There's someone on this bus," she shouted. The driver turned, his face pale. "Miss, we're not moving. How could anyone have gotten on?" But before she could reply, the doors at the front of the bus creaked open. The man in the coat stepped inside, his hollow eyes fixed on Claire. The driver didn't react. He simply stared ahead, as though he couldn't see the figure at all. The man smiled that same unsettling smile. "End of the line," he said. The next morning, the bus was found parked at the side of the highway. The driver was slumped over the wheel, unconscious but unharmed. Claire was nowhere to be found. The only clue was her backpack, left behind on the seat where she'd been sitting. And in the very last row of the bus, a damp, tattered hat. The watcher in the window. The house was too good to be true. At least, that's what Olivia thought when she first saw it. A sprawling, two-story Victorian with ivy creeping up its stone walls and wide windows overlooking a quiet street. It was a dream come true, and the rent was unbelievably cheap. She didn't ask too many questions. Olivia had been looking for a fresh start, and this house was the perfect place to begin again. Her first week there was uneventful. She unpacked, set up her art studio in the upstairs bedroom, and spent her evenings on the porch, enjoying the stillness of the neighborhood. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. It started with a flicker of movement. One evening, as Olivia was painting in her studio, she caught something out of the corner of her eye. She turned toward the window, but there was nothing there, just her reflection staring back at her in the dark glass. She shrugged it off, blaming her overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, the feeling lingered, that strange, nagging sensation of being watched. The next night, it happened again. This time, it was more distinct, a shadow passing across the window, just beyond the edge of her vision. Olivia froze, her paintbrush hovering mid-air. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. She walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The street below was empty, and the garden was still. But something felt wrong. By the third night, Olivia couldn't ignore it anymore. She was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when she heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was the wind rattling the shutters. But as she listened closer, She realized it was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart pounded as she sat up, her eyes scanning the room. The sound was coming from the window. She didn't want to look. Every instinct told her to stay under the covers, to pretend she hadn't heard it. But she couldn't. She crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. Her breath caught in her throat. A face was staring back at her. It was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her. For a moment, she was too stunned to move. And then the face smiled. Olivia screamed, stumbling backward and grabbing her phone. She called the police, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the officers arrived, they found no sign of anyone outside. "Probably just a prank," one of them said, though his tone was less than convincing. "You should keep your doors and windows locked." Olivia nodded, but the unease stayed with her long after they left. Over the next few days, the face appeared again. Always at night, always at the window. It didn't matter which room she was in, her studio, the kitchen, even the bathroom. It was always there. The smile grew wider each time, stretching impossibly far across its face. Olivia tried to ignore it, telling herself it wasn't real. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then, one night, it spoke. "Let me in." The voice was soft, almost pleading. Olivia froze, staring at the window. "Who are you?" she whispered. The face pressed closer, its features distorting against the glass. "I've been waiting for you," it said. "This house is mine." Olivia's blood ran cold. She backed away, her mind racing. She didn't know what this thing was or what it wanted, but she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She packed her bags that night, determined to leave by morning. But as she stuffed clothes into her suitcase, the lights flickered and went out. The house plunged into darkness. Olivia grabbed her flashlight, her heart pounding in her chest. The tapping started again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. She shone the light toward the window, but the face was gone. Instead, the sound came from behind her. She turned slowly, the beam of her flashlight trembling. The face was inside the room. It wasn't just at the window anymore. It was standing in the corner, its body long and thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The smile never left its face as it took a step toward her. Olivia screamed, throwing the flashlight at it and bolting for the door. She didn't stop running until she was outside, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. When she turned back, the house was dark and silent. The face was gone. She never went back. The next day, she broke her lease and moved into a tiny apartment across town. She told herself it didn't matter how cramped it was, at least it was safe. But sometimes, late at night, she hears it. A faint tapping sound, just beyond the edge of her hearing. Tap, tap, tap. She never looks. The reflection. The antique shop wasn't on Claire's route home. In fact, she was pretty sure it hadn't been there the day before. But tonight, as she walked down the dimly lit street, There it was, tucked between two crumbling brick buildings, its windows glowing faintly with golden light. The sign above the door read, "Curiosities and Antiquities." Claire paused. She wasn't in a hurry to get home, and something about the shop called to her. With a shrug, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with strange objects, worn books, rusted tools, porcelain dolls with cracked faces. Behind the counter sat an old man, his eyes pale and cloudy, like he'd seen far more than anyone should. He gave her a nod but didn't say a word. Claire wandered through the aisles, her fingers brushing against the odd trinkets. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a way to pass the time. And then she saw it. It was a mirror. Tall and ornate, its frame carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. The glass was slightly tarnished, giving it an otherworldly shimmer. Claire felt drawn to it. She couldn't explain why, but as she stared into its surface, she felt a strange sense of calm. "How much for this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness of the shop. The old man looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "That mirror," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "is not for everyone." Claire raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It's old," he said, standing and moving toward her. "Older than you think. And peculiar." She laughed nervously. "Peculiar how?" The old man hesitated, his gaze fixed on the mirror. "It shows things. Things you might not want to see." Claire smirked. "Sounds like just the thing I need for my apartment." Despite his reluctance, the man sold it to her. As she carried the mirror out of the shop, she could feel his eyes on her back, as if he was silently urging her to reconsider. That night, Claire set the mirror up in her bedroom. It looked perfect against the wall, catching the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She admired her reflection for a moment, smoothing her hair and smiling to herself. But as she turned to walk away, something made her stop. Her reflection didn't move. She froze, her heart pounding. It had been subtle, just a fraction of a second, but she was sure of it. Her reflection had lingered, watching her, even as she stepped out of frame. Claire shook her head, laughing nervously. "Get a grip," she muttered, crawling into bed. She switched off the light, and the room plunged into darkness. But sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been her imagination. She went about her day as usual: work, coffee with friends, a quick trip to the grocery store. By the time she got home, she'd almost forgotten about the mirror. But that night, as she got ready for bed, it happened again. She was brushing her hair in front of the mirror when she noticed something off. Her reflection wasn't brushing its hair the same way she was. It was slower, deliberate, like it was mimicking her movements rather than copying them. And then, it stopped altogether. Claire stared, her hand frozen mid-stroke. Her reflection stared back, unblinking, its eyes slightly too wide. She stumbled back, her brush clattering to the floor. The reflection smiled. Claire didn't sleep that night. She covered the mirror with a sheet and tried to tell herself it was just stress, or maybe some strange trick of the light. but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next day, she returned to the antique shop. But when she reached the spot where it had been, the shop was gone. The building was boarded up, its windows covered in grime. A faded sign above the door read, "Closed decades ago." When Claire got home, the mirror was waiting for her. The sheet sheet draped over it was crumpled on the floor. Her heart raced as she approached it, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn and run. But she couldn't stop herself. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. The face staring back was similar, but not quite right. The eyes were darker, the smile sharper. And then it spoke. "Let me out." Claire stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of her bed. The voice was low and cold, echoing in her ears. "You brought me here," it said. "You looked into me. Now, I'm looking into you." The reflection pressed its hands against the glass, as if trying to push through. The surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The reflection laughed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can't hide from me, Claire. I am you now." She tried to smash the mirror, grabbing the heaviest object she could find, a lamp, and hurling it at the glass. But the mirror didn't break. Instead, the reflection's smile widened. "You can't get rid of me," it said. "Not now. Not ever." And with that, the lights in her apartment flickered and went out. When they came back on, the mirror was empty. Claire's reflection was gone. At first, she thought it was over, that whatever had happened was finished. But as she turned away, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. The reflection was no longer in the mirror. It was standing behind her. The visitors. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the countryside. Eva had rented a small cottage, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cottage was charming, with ivy creeping up the stone walls, and the sound of the nearby creek lulling her into a peaceful trance. She had everything she needed: a stack of books, a bottle of wine, and a promise to herself that she'd do absolutely nothing for the next 2 days. It was perfect until she heard the knock at the door. It was just after dusk when the sound came. Eva was sitting by the window, reading a novel, when she heard it, soft but deliberate. A single knock. She frowned. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? Reluctantly, she put her book down and walked to the door. Through the small window in the door, she saw a man standing there. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. When she opened the door, he smiled. "Good evening," he said. His voice was smooth, but there was something unsettling about it. Eva took a step back. "Can I help you?" The man glanced over his shoulder, as though checking for something or someone. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm lost. My car broke down about a mile up the road. Would you mind if I used your phone?" Eva hesitated. She hadn't seen another soul for miles. It seemed strange that he would be out here, so far from the nearest town. But his request seemed innocent enough. "Sure," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The man entered and stood awkwardly in the small hallway, looking around as if studying the space. His eyes lingered on the old grandfather clock in the corner, then the fireplace, then the dimly lit kitchen. Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but she brushed it off. "Where's your phone?" she asked, trying to keep things light. "Right over here," he said, nodding toward the kitchen. She led him there, and he picked up the receiver, dialing. Eva busied herself with making tea, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at her. But as she turned to offer him a cup, she froze. He was no longer holding the phone. The receiver was lying on the counter, but the man wasn't there. Eva's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room. He was gone. The silence in the cottage was deafening. Eva walked slowly through the house, checking each room. She called out, but no one answered. The door was still unlocked, the night air chilly and crisp. There was no sign of the man outside. Her mind raced. Had she imagined the whole thing? The next morning, Eva woke with a start, her heart still racing from the night before. She hadn't slept well, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she walked into the kitchen to make coffee, she froze. On the counter was the phone receiver. And next to it, a small piece of paper, folded neatly. Eva unfolded the paper. It read, "We'll be back for you tonight." Her breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, but there was no mistaking the chill it sent through her. She immediately grabbed her things, her phone, her keys, anything she could carry, and went to the car. But as she stepped outside, she heard it. A sound from the woods. A rustling, soft and deliberate, like footsteps, many footsteps moving toward her. She turned, her pulse quickening, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out into the dense trees. She started the car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The engine sputtered to life, and she pressed the gas pedal, eager to get out of there. The drive was long, and Eva couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but there was never anyone behind her. When she reached the edge of the town, she pulled into a small gas station to refuel. The attendant, a young man with a tired smile, handed her the pump. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing her nervously. "I think so," she said, trying to sound calm. But the words felt hollow in her throat. "It's just, this place. I think I'm losing my mind." The attendant's eyes darted to the window, then back at her. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low. Eva frowned. "What do you mean?" "I know the place where you were staying," he said. "I know what happens there." Her stomach sank. "What do you mean? Who was that man?" The attendant looked around, then leaned in closer. "People disappear around that house. Not just one or two. A lot. And the visitors, they come for one reason, they never leave." Eva's hands began to shake. When she returned to the cottage, it was empty. Everything was exactly as it had been the day before. The chair by the fire, the table set for dinner. But it felt wrong. The air was thick with a sense of dread. She stepped into the living room, and that's when she saw it. The reflection. the man standing behind her. The reflection smiled. But it wasn't Eva who was smiling. It was the visitors. The echoing silence. A quiet town, nestled deep in the valley, was where Lara found herself after she'd fled the chaos of the city. It had been a year since she'd left everything behind: her career, her family, the noise of the world, and in search of peace, she'd settled into the small, unassuming cottage at the edge of town. It was a place where time seemed to slow. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the chatter of daily life was replaced by the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, the occasional chirp of birds, and the steady flow of the nearby river. Lara had fallen in love with it immediately. For the first time in years, she was living alone, truly alone. No distractions. No expectations. Just the quiet hum of nature around her. But as much as she tried to convince herself that it was perfect, there was a strange tension in the air, an unease that she couldn't shake. It wasn't just the isolation, it was something more. Something unseen. It nagged at her as she went about her day, like a quiet whisper just at the edge of her hearing, or a shadow flickering in her peripheral vision. It all began with the noise. The first night, it started just after she'd gone to bed. A soft sound, like the creaking of floorboards. The kind of sound that could easily be dismissed if you weren't paying attention. But Lara was. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible. And it came from the attic. Lara had never been up there. There was a narrow staircase that led to a door she'd never opened, and despite the odd tug of curiosity, she had no reason to explore. The house was old, yes, but the attic, from what she could tell, was locked, and she had no plans of unlocking it. The creaking continued, growing louder. She told herself it was just the house settling, the wood shifting with the cold. Still, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night, growing more persistent. As if something was walking around up there, pacing in the dark. The next morning, she dismissed it. "I'm just imagining things," she said to herself as she made a pot of tea. The sound had stopped by morning, and there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The sun was shining brightly, the birds were singing, and Lara felt a sense of peace wash over her again. She decided to spend the day out in the garden, planting flowers, and soaking in the fresh air. But even as she worked, the nagging feeling returned. Something wasn't right. Every now and then, she'd glance up toward the attic window, and the image of someone or something standing in it would flash through her mind. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath, trying to focus on the task at hand. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air seemed to change. The wind picked up, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual. It was then that the creaking started again. At first, it was just a soft shuffle, like footsteps. But then, it grew louder, more deliberate. The sound of something, or someone, moving across the attic floor. Lara sat up in bed, her heart racing. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she strained to listen. The sound wasn't stopping. It was as though whatever was up there was searching for something or someone. The footsteps shuffled back and forth, erratic and agitated. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed the landlord. The call went straight to voicemail. Lara hung up and waited for a few more moments, her ears tuned to the movement above her head. But no one came. The noise just kept going, relentless and impossible to ignore. By the time Lara couldn't take it anymore, it was nearly midnight. She threw on her coat, grabbed a flashlight, and marched toward the attic door. It creaked when she opened it. The narrow staircase loomed before her, dark and ominous. She hesitated. But the sound above her wasn't stopping, and her fear mixed with curiosity pushed her forward. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under her weight. When she reached the top, she stood in front of the door. It was ajar, as if someone or something had left it open. She stepped inside. The attic was cold. A long-forgotten scent of mildew and dust filled the air. The space was filled with old furniture, boxes, and a forgotten wardrobe. But there was nothing, no signs of anyone being there. Yet, as she scanned the room, her flashlight flicked across the far corner. For a brief moment, she saw a shadow. A figure, hunched over and still. Lara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward slowly, the light shaking in her hand. The figure didn't move. But then, as the beam of her flashlight landed directly on it, she realized there was no one there. The silence was deafening. Lara quickly spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't imagined it, she knew she hadn't. But there was nothing. The room was empty. Just the wind, she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The strange sense of being watched, of being followed, pressed down on her as she backed away toward the door. She was about to turn to leave when she heard something. A soft whisper. At first, it was too quiet to make out. Then, it became clearer. "Help me." The words echoed in the empty space, sending a chill down her spine. Lara stumbled backward, her flashlight dropping from her hand. The whispering grew louder, closer. "Help me." It was coming from the far corner of the attic, from a stack of boxes. Lara turned and bolted down the stairs, not stopping until she was back in her bedroom. She locked the door behind her and curled up in her bed, shaking. Her mind was racing, and she couldn't make sense of what had just happened. The room had been empty. She'd seen it with her own eyes. Yet the voice, the whispering, was it real? For the next few days, Lara tried to go on with her life. But the unease never left. She began to notice things, small things that weren't quite right. Objects out of place. A window that had been closed was now open. And the whispers, faint, barely audible, seemed to follow her wherever she went. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Every night, she'd lock the doors and check every window before crawling into bed. But no matter how tightly she shut herself off from the world, the silence always returned, echoing in her ears, pressing in on her, suffocating her. And then, one night, it happened. She heard it again. The footsteps, but this time, they were louder, heavier, more purposeful. Lara rushed to the attic, flashlight in hand, heart racing in her chest. But when she opened the door, it was empty. That's when she saw it, the reflection. It wasn't in the mirror, but in the glass of the attic window. A figure stood behind her, its face twisted and pale. It was her own reflection, but not quite. The eyes, black and hollow, stared at her with an intensity she couldn't comprehend. Before she could react, the reflection spoke. "Help me!" Lara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the room. She turned, expecting to see someone or something, but there was no one there. Only the cold, empty space of the attic. In the days that followed, Lara couldn't escape it. The reflection followed her every move, appearing in every window, in every mirror. She couldn't look away. The whispers had returned, growing louder, more insistent. Every night, they called to her. And with each passing day, the figure in the glass grew closer. The last time Lara saw it, it reached out from the glass, its hand pressing against the window, leaving a stain of condensation on the glass. And then it whispered again. "Help me, before it's too late." The old man's lantern. There was something strange about the town of Black Hollow, but nobody talked about it. It was one of those places where people lived quietly, their lives blending into the background like fading photographs. Outsiders passed through but rarely stayed, and those who did, found themselves trapped by the town's eerie atmosphere. An unspoken rule kept everyone inside, especially at night. The town's most prominent feature wasn't its narrow streets or old buildings. It was the looming, decaying house at the far end of the village. No one had ever seen the owner, or at least, no one had ever claimed to. The house sat dark for years, a long-forgotten relic of a time long past. The locals would tell stories of strange flickers of light seen from the windows, and whispers about the old man who had once lived there. But those were just stories, weren't they? For Sophia, the decision to move to Black Hollow wasn't an easy one. She had left the bustling city behind, seeking quiet and solitude, wanting to escape the noise, the chaos, the endless crowd. Black Hollow seemed like a perfect choice, even with its oddities. Her small cottage on the edge of town was quaint, with ivy crawling up the sides and a small garden in the back. The first few days passed in peace until nightfall. The first night in Black Hollow was calm and quiet. Sophia unpacked boxes, opened windows, and breathed in the fresh, crisp air of her new home. But as dusk settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, she noticed something strange. A lantern light, glowing faintly from the direction of the decaying house. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the reflection of a street light. But as the night deepened, the light flickered and swayed, moving slightly, as if someone was carrying it. Curiosity gnawed at Sophia's mind, and against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. She walked through the sleepy streets, the cool air settling around her like a heavy blanket. The lantern light seemed to grow brighter as she approached the house, and a strange sensation crept over her, like something was watching her from behind the rotting windows. The house loomed ahead, its broken windows staring down at her like empty eyes. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from within. Sophia hesitated, but then, driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. The floorboards creaked underfoot as she made her way through the dark hallway. The only light was that damned lantern, glowing faintly at the far end of the corridor. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. As she stepped closer, the flickering light revealed the figure of an old man standing in the middle of the room. His clothes were worn, his hair long and white, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. He stood motionless, the lantern clasped tightly in his hand. Sophia stopped in her tracks, unsure of what to do. "Are you the owner of the house?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man didn't move. His head tilted slightly, and for a moment, Sophia thought he might speak. But then, the silence deepened, the air growing colder, heavier. She stepped forward. "Are you all right?" Still, no answer. Sophia turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she felt at his eyes, staring at her, cold and unblinking. "Don't leave," the voice rasped. Sophia spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The man was still standing there, but now his face was visible, pale and wrinkled, his eyes hollow and dark, like windows to a place beyond the living. "Why do you stay here?" Sophia whispered, fear creeping into her voice. He raised the lantern slightly, casting an eerie glow over his face. "Because I have nowhere else to go." That night, Sophia barely slept. The image of the old man haunted her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Black Hollow, that there was more to the town than met the eye. The following day, Sophia spoke to the town's only shopkeeper, a quiet woman named Edith. As she purchased a loaf of bread, Sophia mentioned the old house and the lantern. "You shouldn't go near that place, dear," Edith said softly, her voice laced with caution. "It's not what you think." Sophia frowned, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Edith glanced around, lowering her voice. "The man with the lantern is the last of his kind. He's been there for years, standing watch over something you don't want to know about. If you value your peace, stay away from him. Stay away from the house." Sophia's mind raced as she left the shop. Stay away? How could she? She had seen the lantern, heard the old man's voice. There was something in her that demanded answers, a need to understand what Black Hollow was hiding. That night, she returned to the house. The lantern was already glowing, brighter now, casting long shadows across the walls. She stepped inside again, her footsteps careful but determined. The man was there, waiting for her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I warned you," he rasped, his voice rough like gravel. Sophia's heart thudded in her chest. "What is this place?" she asked. The man raised the lantern, revealing a trapdoor hidden beneath the rug. "There's something beneath," he said, his voice trembling. "I keep it locked away, but tonight," he paused, his face contorted in pain. "Tonight, it wants to be free." Sophia didn't understand, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. She stepped toward the trapdoor. The air grew colder with every movement, the light flickering more erratically as if warning her to stop. But she couldn't. The desire for truth was overpowering. With a creak, the trapdoor opened. Below, the darkness stretched deeper than she had expected. Her flashlight trembled in her hand as she descended the narrow staircase. As she reached the bottom, she could hear something breathing, something moving in the shadows. Her pulse quickened. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. Then, she saw it. A shadow. Dark, shifting, reaching toward her. And there, in the midst of it, glowing faintly, was the lantern. The same one the old man had carried. She stepped closer, heart pounding. The shadow twisted, and then, suddenly, it spoke. "Help me, take the lantern, let it free." Sophia froze. The figure before her was like nothing she had ever seen. Its shape was amorphous, flickering like smoke, its voice a chorus of whispers. It reached out, its long, spindly fingers curling toward the lantern. "Take it," it whispered again. "Let me live. Let me out." The lantern flickered wildly as Sophia's hands shook. She wanted to run, to escape the thing before her. But her curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. Her eyes locked on the lantern, the key to whatever dark force lay beneath Black Hollow. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. But before she could grab the lantern, the figure in front of her lunged. "No," she screamed, stumbling backward. The air shifted. The lantern's glow intensified, blinding her for a moment. And then, the whispers stopped. When Sophia woke, she was lying in the dirt, the night air still and silent around her. The lantern was gone. The figure, the voice, all of it had vanished. She quickly stood, her head spinning. She ran back to the house, her heart hammering. The old man was gone, and so was the lantern. But the town of Black Hollow had changed. The streets felt emptier, quieter. No one seemed to notice her as she walked through, her mind racing with what she had seen, what she had done. As she passed by the decaying house one last time, she saw the lantern, flickering in the window. And in the shadows, the figure was waiting. The door behind a wall. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of the village, half hidden behind overgrown ivy and the sprawling trees of the woods. It was a house that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the house itself was a secret best left forgotten. When Emily first arrived, she didn't know any of these stories. She had just moved to the area, seeking peace after the death of her father. She wanted a fresh start, and this farmhouse, with its creaking floors and chipped paint, seemed like the perfect escape from the city. She didn't mind the solitude, in fact, she welcomed it. The house had character, and that's what mattered to her. The house had been in disrepair for years, but Emily was determined to fix it up. She spent the first few weeks cleaning, repairing, and painting. But there was always something off about the place, a feeling like someone was watching her. She'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, or hear the faintest whisper on the wind. It was nothing she could explain, but it made her uneasy. It was on the third night that she first noticed the door behind the wall. It was an old house, with a layout that made no sense. Emily had been exploring the house one evening when she stumbled upon a strange patch of the wall in the living room. The wallpaper there was a different color, as if it had been replaced more recently than the rest of the house. Curious, she examined it more closely, tracing her fingers over the smooth surface. And then, she felt it. A faint indentation in the wall. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. She pressed harder, and to her surprise, the wall gave way. With a creak, a small section of the wall slid open, revealing a door she had never seen before. The door was old, with iron hinges that had rusted with time. It wasn't particularly large, but it looked out of place, as if it had always been there, hiding in plain sight. The faintest draft of air slipped from behind the door, carrying with it a smell of dust and something older. Emily hesitated, a sense of foreboding creeping over her. Something about the door felt wrong, but her curiosity was stronger. She had to know what was behind it. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow, dark staircase that spiraled downward. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The door slammed shut behind her with a loud thud, causing her heart to race. There was a small landing at the bottom of the stairs, and in the dim light, Emily could just make out the shape of a wooden door. Unlike the one upstairs, this door was solid, sealed shut by what looked like old, rusted bolts. Her breath came in short bursts as she approached it, her mind filled with questions. Why had this door been hidden for so long? Why was it bolted shut? The door was cold to the touch, and when she pushed against it, it didn't budge. She pulled harder, but the rusted bolts held it firmly in place. Frustrated, she turned away from the door. That's when she heard it. A soft tapping sound, almost imperceptible at first, like fingernails scratching against wood. It was coming from behind the door. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard it clearly now, and it was unmistakable, a deliberate tapping, as though someone was trying to get her attention. She leaned closer to the door, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling in the cold air. There was no response, only the tapping, growing louder now. It was rhythmic, measured, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. "Who's there?" she whispered, pressing her ear to the door. For a moment, there was silence. And then, a voice. It was soft, a whisper that made her skin crawl, but she could hear it clearly. "Let me out." The words sent a chill through her entire body. She pulled away from the door, her hands shaking. She knew that whatever was behind it, she didn't want to know. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Over the next few days, Emily found herself drawn back to the door. She couldn't stop thinking about it, about the tapping, about the voice. There was something in her that refused to let it go, a strange obsession taking root in her mind. Every night, after the sun had set and the house had fallen into silence, she would creep down to the basement, stand before the door, and listen. The tapping continued, every night, without fail. And the whispers. "Let me out," it would say, followed by a soft scraping sound, like nails against stone. One evening, after a particularly long day of repairs, Emily could no longer resist. She had to know what was behind that door. She grabbed a crowbar from the shed and returned to the basement. She pried at the bolts, the metal screeching against the rust. It took longer than she expected, but finally, with a final tug, the bolts gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. It was hard to breathe, and the smell of decay was overpowering. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight flickering in the darkness. She scanned the room with growing dread. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like old, dried blood. There was a small wooden chair in the center of the room, its legs cracked and splintered. And in the far corner, just beyond the reach of her flashlight, was a figure. A figure, hunched over and motionless. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. The figure was wrapped in tattered cloth, its face obscured by shadows. And then, it moved. The figure slowly turned its head toward her, its eyes glowing a faint, unnatural red. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that were sharp and yellowed. It grinned at her, a grotesque and twisted expression. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. Before she could react, the figure lunged forward, its arms reaching out toward her. She screamed, stumbling backward, but her feet tangled in the chair, sending it crashing to the floor. The figure was on top of her now, its cold, clammy hands gripping her arms. She struggled, panic surging through her, but it was too strong. "Let me out," it rasped again, its voice low and guttural. "Let me out, or I'll never let you go." The house seemed to close in around her. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and the temperature dropped sharply. Emily kicked and thrashed, but the figure wouldn't let go. Its eyes bored into hers, and she felt as though something deep inside her was being pulled away, as if it were trying to take her very soul. But then, in a final surge of adrenaline, she managed to break free. She scrambled to her feet, running as fast as she could, slamming the door behind her. When she reached the stairs, she could hear the figure calling out to her, its voice growing louder and more frantic. "Let me out," it screamed. Emily never returned to that basement again. She packed her things the very next day and left the farmhouse, leaving the door and the figure and whatever was behind that wall forever. Years later, she would return to the village, but she never spoke of what had happened. She never spoke of the tapping, the whispers, or the thing behind the wall. Some secrets, she learned, are best left buried. The lantern in the woods. The small town of Willowbrook was like any other. A quiet place where the streets were lined with old oak trees, the houses were kept neat and tidy, and the evenings fell still with the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. For the most part, life was simple and predictable. But there was always something about the woods on the edge of town. People didn't talk about it much, but the woods were different. Darker, somehow. Most of the locals kept their distance, and the few who ventured too far into the trees were quick to come back, muttering about strange sights, eerie sounds, or feelings of being watched. But for Sophie, Willowbrook was a fresh start. After the loss of her mother and the shattering of her family, she had moved from the city, hoping for peace and quiet. Sophie had heard the rumors about the woods, of course, but she didn't believe them. They were just stories, whispers shared over tea in the local cafe. One evening, as she wandered the outskirts of town, Sophie found herself standing at the edge of the woods. It wasn't an unfamiliar sight, she had walked past this place many times. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange pull in the air, a stillness that felt as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. Curiosity tugged at her. Without thinking, Sophie stepped off the path and into the trees. The moment she crossed into the woods, the world seemed to shift. The light from the street lamps faded quickly, swallowed by the thick canopy above. The air was cooler, the ground soft beneath her boots. It was so quiet. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves. Just an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. Sophie walked deeper, her steps hesitant but drawn forward. The trees here were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled like the bones of some long-forgotten creature. As she pushed forward, she saw the flicker of light in the distance. A lantern. At first, Sophie thought it might be the remnants of a campfire, left behind by someone who had wandered too far. But the closer she got, the stranger it seemed. The lantern was hanging from a crooked branch, swinging gently in the windless air, casting a cold, pale glow. Its light didn't flicker like a regular flame. It was steady, almost unnatural in its brightness. Without thinking, Sophie stepped closer. As she reached the lantern, the light seemed to dim slightly, as if it were recognizing her presence. There was something almost welcoming about it, drawing her in. She looked around, half expecting to find someone else standing in the shadows, but there was no one. Just the quiet. Sophie stood there for a long time, staring at the lantern, entranced by the odd calm it gave her. She was about to turn away when something made her glance up. A figure. Standing between the trees, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. Sophie froze. The figure was tall, its form obscured by the shadows, but Sophie could feel its gaze. It was as if the very air around her thickened, pressing in. And in that moment, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Who's there?" Sophie called out, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the figure stepped forward into the light. The first thing Sophie noticed were its eyes, wide and unblinking, staring directly at her. They glowed, but not in any natural way. They were cold, like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. The figure's face was pale, unnaturally so, and its expression, empty. It wore a cloak of dark fabric, the edges tattered, but it was the thing in its hands that made Sophie's stomach twist. A lantern. The same kind. It was identical to the one hanging from the tree. But the glow of its light was wrong. Darker. The edges of the flame seemed to move unnaturally, as though it were alive, pulsating. The figure didn't speak, but Sophie could hear its voice in her mind. It's time. Sophie wanted to run. Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned toward the path. But the moment she took a step, the lanterns flickered, both the one hanging from the tree and the one in the figure's hand. The woods seemed to close in on her. She stumbled backward, her breath catching. The path was gone. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed her up. "Where am I?" Sophie whispered, panic creeping into her voice. The figure took a step closer. Its footsteps were silent, but the air around it seemed to hum with tension. "You came here of your own will," it said, its voice low, gravelly. "Now you will stay." Sophie's pulse raced. She glanced around wildly, looking for any way out. But the trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches twisting into impossible shapes. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as though the forest itself were alive. The figure stepped forward again, its lantern swinging slightly as if beckoning her toward it. "There is no escaping the woods," it whispered. "Not once you've seen the lantern. Not once you've stepped into the shadow." Sophie felt a chill crawl up her spine. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, and she could hear it more clearly than she'd ever heard anything before. "You must remain, just like the others." With a scream, Sophie turned and ran. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the trees closing in around her like a maze, and the light of the lantern grew distant, flickering faintly in the periphery of her vision. She pushed forward, ignoring the stinging branches that clawed at her skin, her breath ragged and panicked. But the more she ran, the more the woods seemed to stretch, to distort. The path she had walked was gone. The trees were endless. The lantern's light flickered, then dimmed entirely. And the sound of footsteps, soft but growing louder, followed her every movement. She ran faster, heart pounding, but it didn't help. The woods were pulling her back in. She could feel the pull of it now, the tug of the lantern, its light reaching toward her like a hand. The whispering grew louder. "You're mine now." She stumbled and fell, the ground beneath her hands soft and cold. As she tried to push herself up, her hand brushed against something smooth. The lantern. The same one. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of lanterns hung in the trees around her, each one casting its eerie glow on the twisted faces of figures standing in the shadows. And in the center of it all, the figure with the glowing eyes stepped forward once more. "Welcome to the woods," it said softly. "The lanterns are waiting." The next morning, the town of Willowbrook awoke to the sound of birds chirping, the sun shining through the trees. The air was still, peaceful. And yet, there was something different about the woods. In the distance, on the edge of the forest, a lantern hung from a crooked branch, swinging gently in the windless air, casting its cold, pale glow over the land. And in the shadows of the trees, something moved, waiting. The last passenger. It was nearing midnight when Daniel boarded the train. He had been traveling for hours, but now the journey was almost over. The small, quaint town he had been heading to wasn't far from here. He was tired, but relieved. It had been a long, exhausting trip, and he was looking forward to settling down for the night. As he walked to his seat, he glanced around a nearly empty train car. A few scattered passengers sat quietly, their heads buried in books or phones. The overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows across the walls. The train was old, and though it had its charm, it made an unsettling creak every time it accelerated, as though the tracks beneath it were groaning under its weight. Daniel took his seat by the window and settled in, gazing out at the passing landscape. The night was dark, the only light coming from the occasional street lamp or the distant glow of a nearby town. The rhythm of the train's wheels on the tracks lulled him into a sense of comfort. His eyelids grew heavy, and he leaned back in his seat, allowing the gentle rocking motion of the train to ease him toward sleep. But then, there was a sound. A faint, distant thud. It wasn't loud enough to cause alarm, but it made him sit up straight, eyes darting around the car. The other passengers didn't seem to notice, engrossed in their own worlds. The thud came again, louder this time, like something hitting the metal of the train's exterior. Daniel turned toward the door at the far end of the car. He had assumed the train was stationary for the moment, but the faint movement of the door at the end of the hallway suggested otherwise. His gaze shifted to the conductor's booth, but the lights inside were dim. He couldn't see anyone. He tried to shake the unease gnawing at his chest. Probably just a stray animal or something, he muttered to himself. But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch brushing against the side of the train. The sound came again, this time closer, sharper. And then, silence. He looked at the time on his phone. The train was supposed to reach the town in about 15 minutes, but the sensation of being alone in the car, surrounded by shadows, was becoming increasingly unsettling. He rose from his seat, wanting to stretch his legs before the ride ended. His footsteps echoed through the empty car as he walked toward the back. The door to the next car was slightly ajar. A soft light spilled into the hallway, but no one was there. He hesitated for a moment, but then, his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the hallway and moved toward the next car. Just as he reached the next door, the train gave a sudden jolt, sending him stumbling forward. The lights flickered, then came back on. Daniel steadied himself, looking around at the now empty car. A low hum came from the far corner. "Hello," Daniel called out. He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe to make sure there was no one else nearby, or maybe just to test the silence. There was no response, just the hum. It was a strange sound, coming from the far side of the car, near the luggage compartment. He cautiously stepped toward it, his shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. Then, just as he was about to peer around a corner, something moved in the shadows. A figure. A man dressed in a dark, long coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, was standing by the luggage, staring at him with unnerving stillness. "Excuse me, sir, are you all right?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his back straight, his hands clenched at his sides. Daniel couldn't see his face clearly, but he could feel the coldness radiating from him. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "Are you traveling to the same place?" he asked, hoping the man would speak. But there was no answer. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Daniel looked around, growing increasingly uncomfortable. Something about the man seemed off, unnaturally still, like he wasn't even breathing. The train gave another jolt, this time more severe. The lights flickered once more, then went completely dark for a brief second. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the car, his pulse quickening. He looked around, but there was no trace of the figure. No sound. No movement. Just the empty, silent train car stretching out before him. He backed away, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread settle over him. He turned and hurried back toward the first car. His footsteps rang out sharply, breaking the oppressive silence. As he returned to his seat, he noticed something strange. The train hadn't stopped. It was still moving, but it felt wrong. The world outside the window had changed. The landscape that had once passed by in the distance was now dark, so dark that Daniel could no longer see anything beyond the blurred outlines of trees. The lights of the distant town were gone, swallowed by the night. Then, he heard the sound again. The soft thudding, this time much closer. He whipped around to face the back of the car. There, standing by the door, was the man in the dark coat, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows, and the train jolted once again, this time much harder. The lights flickered, and Daniel was thrown from his seat, his body crashing to the floor. His breath caught in his throat as the train screeched to a sudden stop. He looked up, and the man was gone. Daniel scrambled to his feet, heart racing. He looked around the car, but there was no sign of the figure. It was as though he had vanished entirely. The train's lights flickered once more, and a strange voice echoed through the intercom system. "We're almost there, sir. Please prepare for arrival." Daniel's blood ran cold. He had never heard the voice before. It was distorted, deep, and almost robotic. "We're almost there." But there was no station in sight. The tracks stretched on endlessly, shrouded in darkness, the sound of the train's wheels screeching against the metal rails as if it were heading nowhere. A deep, unsettling hum filled the car, growing louder with each passing second. "Please prepare for arrival." The voice repeated itself. It was getting closer. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The train was still. The lights went out completely. The door to the car swung open on its own, and for the briefest of moments, Daniel saw something. A flicker of movement in the darkness. The man in the coat. This time, his face was visible. His eyes were empty, hollow, black pits that stared directly into Daniel's soul. With a gasp, Daniel jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. The train was not just stopped. It was not moving at all. The entire car was silent now. He stepped toward the door, desperate to escape, but as he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was as though something was holding it shut from the outside. The dark figure stood just beyond the door, its shadow stretching across the floor. And then, the voice spoke again. "You'll never leave." Everything went black. When Daniel awoke, he was lying on the floor of the train car, surrounded by an eerie silence. The lights flickered back on, casting a dim glow over the abandoned seats. The train was still, the air heavy with the smell of dust and metal. But the train wasn't moving anymore. The tracks outside the window were empty, as if no one had passed through in years. The man in the coat was gone. and Daniel was alone. He never made it to the town. The train never reached its destination. And the last passenger? He was still riding the rails. The echo in the walls. The old house at the end of Hawthorne Street had stood empty for as long as anyone in the town could remember. It was a large, crumbling Victorian mansion, its windows dark and shattered, the once grand front porch now a rotting mess of broken wood. Children dared each other to touch the iron gate, but no one ever ventured close enough to go inside. Except for Clara. She had moved to the small town just 2 weeks ago. Having recently gone through a painful breakup and the loss of her job, Clara was looking for something new. The quiet town seemed perfect. She found an apartment in a humble building, right across from the mansion, and the locals had been kind enough to point her in the direction of some basic amenities. But no one had said much about the house on Hawthorne Street. One evening, as Clara made her way home from the store, she saw it again, the mansion. It loomed over the street like a shadow, its windows black and empty. But this time, there was something different. As the last light of day faded and the air grew colder, Clara noticed something strange. A faint light flickered behind one of the upstairs windows. Just for a moment. She stopped in her tracks, squinting at the window. Was it just the reflection of a passing car? Or had someone been inside? The light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the darkness behind. Clara shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. It was a dilapidated old house, after all. Of course, it would look strange in the fading light. But as she stood there on the sidewalk, staring at it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The next day, Clara found herself walking past the mansion again, a feeling of unease tugging at her. As she neared the gate, she saw an old man standing at the base of the steps leading to the porch. He was hunched over, his clothes faded and worn, and his hair was a matted mess. He looked as though he had been standing there for hours, his eyes fixed on the door. Clara stopped, unsure of what to do. She hadn't seen anyone else around lately. The man must have been new to the area. Or, perhaps, he was just another local eccentric. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the man turned his head and met her gaze. His eyes were wide and wild, a strange emptiness to them. A cold shiver ran down Clara's spine as she took a step back, her feet instinctively moving away from the gate. The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Don't go inside," he said in a hoarse voice, as if the words had been caught in his throat for years. "It's not safe." The walls, they echo. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure whether it was the strange man or the cryptic words that made her heart race. The town was quiet, but this felt off. She wanted to leave. She wanted to keep walking, to forget this strange encounter ever happened. But something about the old man's warning lingered in her mind, gnawing at her, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. That night, Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't sleep. The words of the old man kept replaying in her head. The walls, they echo. What did he mean? What was inside the house? Around midnight, she finally couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know. Slipping into her jacket, Clara grabbed her flashlight and went outside. She stood at the edge of the gate, staring at the mansion's dark silhouette against the night sky. A strange pull tugged at her chest, urging her to move forward. The air was cold, and the wind had picked up, rattling the trees. She told herself it was just a house. But it was more than that. There was something in the way it loomed over her, dark and foreboding. Something was waiting there. With a deep breath, Clara stepped toward the front door. She reached for the knob. It was cold to the touch, but it turned easily. As she pushed the door open, the hinges groaned loudly, and she flinched, her heart racing. But she stepped inside. The air inside the mansion was thick and musty, a sharp contrast to the crisp night air. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she shone her flashlight around the entryway. The wallpaper peeled in places, and dust seemed to hang in the air, untouched for years. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. A soft sound echoed through the halls. At first, Clara thought it was just the house settling. But then it came again. The faintest of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She froze. The echo in the house continued. The footsteps seemed to be moving, following her. She turned around quickly, shining her flashlight down the dark hallway, but there was no one there. Her heart thudded in her chest as the echo grew louder. It was like someone was walking just behind her, but whenever she turned, the space was empty. The floor beneath her feet creaked again, and Clara gasped, taking a step backward. That's when she saw it, a door at the end of the hall, cracked open just enough for a sliver of light to spill out. The echoing footsteps seemed to come from that room. Clara's hands trembled as she took slow, cautious steps toward the door. The light grew brighter, illuminating the hallway with a soft glow. As she reached the door, she paused, her heart pounding in her ears. There was a voice now, low and distorted, like it was coming from deep inside the walls. "Help me." The whisper echoed through the house. It sounded like it was everywhere, but at the same time, nowhere. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Clara pushed the door open, the room beyond bathed in the eerie light. It was a small, dimly lit room filled with old furniture, tables, chairs, cabinets. The air was thick, stagnant, as if the room had been shut off from the rest of the house for years. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a mirror. The mirror was old, its frame cracked and faded. But Clara could see her reflection clearly in it, though her own image seemed distorted somehow, like she was standing in a dream. Her eyes looked hollow, her skin pale, almost ghostly. But there was something else. In the reflection, behind her, something moved. It was just a shadow at first, but then it came into focus. A figure, standing in the doorway. The same man from outside. His wild eyes stared at her, and he smiled, that same, unsettling grin. "Leave now," the figure whispered. Clara spun around, but there was no one there. The house groaned again, and the whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave, before it gets you." Clara didn't hesitate. She turned and ran out of the room, through the dark hallways, past the doors that opened and closed behind her, as if the house itself were alive, watching her. When she finally burst out of the front door and into the cold night air, she could still hear the whispering. It followed her, just on the edge of her hearing. The next morning, Clara couldn't remember much of the night. Her head ached, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. The mansion stood silently across the street, its windows dark and lifeless, as if nothing had ever happened. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that she was still adjusting to the strange new town. But the whispering never stopped. Weeks later, Clara moved out. She didn't want to, but something was drawing her away from Hawthorne Street, away from the mansion. She could still hear the echoes. They followed her wherever she went. And, on the rare occasions when she would turn her head quickly, she would see a shadow standing just behind her, grinning. The echoing hour. It was late when Michael arrived at the small, secluded town of Eldridge. He had driven for hours, the roads twisting through dense forests and rolling hills. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The sky above was a deep shade of navy, stars scattered across it like glimmers of forgotten light. He had been looking for a place to stay, and Eldridge seemed as good as any. The town was quiet, too quiet. As Michael drove through its main street, the flickering of the street lamps cast long shadows on the cobblestone roads. There wasn't much activity. No bustling shops, no laughter spilling from windows. It was as if the town had been forgotten by time. He pulled into the small inn that sat at the edge of the town. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with thin gray hair, welcomed him in with a warm smile, though her eyes seemed distant, as if lost in some long-forgotten memory. "You must be tired," she said, her voice raspy, yet kind. "You'll find your room just up the stairs. Don't worry. It's quiet here. You'll sleep well." Michael nodded, unsure of what to make of her odd comment. As he trudged upstairs, the old wooden floorboards creaked under his weight, groaning as though the house itself was trying to speak. His room was small, dimly lit by a single lamp. The window overlooked the quiet town square, the cobblestone streets bathed in moonlight. The bed was old but comfortable, and after unpacking, he lay down to rest, but sleep wasn't as easy to find. The stillness of the town weighed on him, as though the air itself was holding its breath. The clock on the nightstand ticked, each second dragging on longer than the last. Around midnight, Michael finally managed to fall asleep. Then, he heard it. A sound, faint at first. The softest tapping, like fingers brushing against glass. He stirred, blinking into the darkness of the room, unsure whether he was imagining it or not. The sound came again, tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the room, the shadows stretching out across the floor. But there was nothing. Just the faint flicker of the lamp. The tapping came again. This time, it was closer. Michael stood up, pushing the covers off his legs. He walked toward the window, opening the curtains just a crack, but saw nothing unusual. The square below was empty, no signs of movement. The street lamps illuminated the square with an eerie calm. He shut the curtain, turning back toward the bed, his nerves on edge. Maybe it was just the wind, he told himself. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Hours passed, and the tapping stopped. Yet, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. There was something in the air, something that had settled in the house, something that hadn't been there when he first arrived. It was as though the house itself was waiting for something. As the clock struck 3 a.m., a sudden chill filled the room. Michael shivered, his breath coming out in faint clouds as he pulled the covers tighter around himself. The clock on the wall seemed louder now, the ticking relentless, echoing in the silence. Then, something changed. The ticking of the clock grew louder. The faint tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just one sound, it was as though multiple people were tapping, rapping on the window, on the walls. It was all around him, louder, more frantic. Michael's heart raced. He bolted out of bed, his feet thumping heavily against the floor as he rushed to the door. But before he could reach it, the sound stopped. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice. Soft. Distant. But clear. Come and join us. Michael froze. The voice wasn't outside the room. It was inside his head. It felt like a whisper, crawling into his mind. He couldn't tell whether it was real or if his exhaustion was playing tricks on him. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to shake the feeling, but it lingered. The words echoed in his mind. He turned, his eyes darting toward the window. The moonlight was brighter now, and the square below was still. Then, he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the square, motionless. Its outline was shrouded in shadow, but there was something undeniably wrong about the way it stood, unnaturally still, unmoving. It was as if it was waiting for him, beckoning him to come closer. The tapping resumed, louder this time, and it seemed to come from all around him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stumbled backward, heart pounding. Come and join us, the voice repeated, this time louder, more insistent. Come and join us before the hour ends. Michael spun around, his mind racing. He had to get out. The door was only a few feet away. He rushed toward it, his hands fumbling for the doorknob. But it wouldn't turn. He tugged and pulled, but it remained locked. Panicking, he turned back to the window, but the figure in the square was gone. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it felt like the walls were closing in on him. Then, as quickly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Michael collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Sweat clung to his skin as he tried to steady himself. His mind raced. What was happening? What was in this house? And then, the clock struck. A single, resounding chime that echoed through the room. It's time. The door to his room swung open. Slowly. Quietly. But there was no one there. Just the empty hallway beyond. The same voice, clearer now, as if it were coming from right behind him. It's time for you to join us. Michael stood up shakily, his legs barely holding him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the cold, empty space. But something was different. He could feel it. The air was thick, oppressive. The clock chimed again. This time, the voice didn't whisper. It shouted, "Come to us." With every ounce of willpower, Michael ran toward the door. The hallway was dark, but the air in the inn was thick with the sound of breathing. Faint at first, then louder. All around him, echoing in the walls. The moment his foot crossed the threshold of the door, a sudden jolt ran through him, like an electric shock, and he froze in place. His vision blurred. The hallway seemed to stretch out before him, elongating as though the building itself was shifting. The clock continued to chime. The tapping returned, louder than ever. And then, as the final chime of the clock sounded, Michael's vision cleared. The hallway stretched back into focus. He was standing in the lobby of the inn, but everything had changed. The walls were covered in dust, and the furniture was broken and decaying. The innkeeper was standing behind the counter, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a knowing smile. "You've joined us." Her voice was flat, lifeless. "Welcome to the hour." The door to the inn swung open. But no one ever leaves? The silent watcher. The rain fell heavily that evening, the dark clouds overhead rolling across the sky like a thick blanket, muffling the world beneath. The small, isolated town of Ravensbrook was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets were empty except for a few drenched souls hurrying toward their homes. Marissa had been in town for less than a week. She had moved into the old, weathered cottage at the edge of Ravensbrook, a place she had found after an exhausting search for peace and solitude. She had no intention of staying in a bustling city anymore. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush, she needed a break from it all. The cottage seemed perfect, tucked away from everything, with a small garden and a view of the woods behind it. The first few days had been peaceful. The kind of peace that felt almost too quiet. Marissa had been content until she noticed something strange. It started with the lights. On the fourth night of her stay, as she sat reading by the fireplace, Marissa saw it out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moving past the window. Her heart skipped a beat. She stood up quickly, walking over to the window and peering out, but there was nothing. The yard was empty, the trees in the distance swaying gently in the wind. She shook her head, dismissing it. It was probably a deer or some other creature moving through the yard. But the feeling stuck with her. It gnawed at the back of her mind as she returned to her seat by the fire. The next night, it happened again. She was just about to fall asleep when she noticed the shadow again. This time, it was more distinct, a tall, dark shape standing at the edge of her yard, barely visible in the dim light from the window. Marissa stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the figure for a long moment, but when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. "It's just the storm," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. "Just a tree, a trick of the light." But it didn't feel like a trick. The figure had been too real. The following day, Marissa decided to take a walk into the town to clear her head. The air was damp, the road slick with rain, and the fog rolled across the streets, curling around the buildings like a living thing. As she passed by the small shops, most of them shuttered for the evening, she ran into an older man leaning against a lamppost. His clothes were old-fashioned, like he had stepped out of another era, and his eyes were sharp, piercing through the fog. "New around here, huh?" he asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Marissa nodded, trying to be polite. "Yes, just moved in last week. Up on the hill." He looked at her for a long moment, and his gaze softened, almost pitying. "You might want to be careful up there," he said quietly. "The house on the hill. It's been empty for years. And it's best left that way." Marissa frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man hesitated before shaking his head. "Nothing. Just make sure you keep your windows locked at night. Strange things happen in Ravensbrück." With that, he turned and walked off, disappearing into the fog. That night, Marissa couldn't shake the man's words. "Strange things happen," she muttered under her breath as she walked back to her cottage. She tried to push the unease from her mind. Maybe the man was just a local with too many stories to tell. But still, the strange shadow she had seen outside the window lingered in her mind. That evening, she ate dinner quickly, feeling restless. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, she drew the curtains and locked the doors, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar silence. But the silence only seemed to grow louder. It wasn't long before she saw it again. The shadow. This time, it was unmistakable. A figure stood just outside the window, standing motionless, staring into the house. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared back, her body frozen with fear. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure did not move. It was tall and thin, almost too thin, its face obscured by darkness, but she could feel its eyes upon her. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The following morning, Marissa called the landlord, hoping to get some answers. The woman who answered the phone was polite but distant. "Oh, the cottage," the woman said with a small chuckle. "It's a lovely spot, isn't it? But I must admit, there's something about the house. People have lived there before, but they've never stayed long." Marissa felt her heart sink. "Why not? What happened?" The landlord's voice lowered. "People say the house is haunted, but there's something else. Something in the woods behind it. I don't know what it is. But I'd stay inside at night, if I were you. Just keep the windows locked." That night, as the wind howled outside, Marissa lay in bed, wide awake. She had checked the windows, locked every door, and tried to calm her racing heart. But as the clock struck midnight, she heard something she hadn't expected. A tap. It came from the window. Her breath caught in her throat as the tap came again, followed by another, and another, faster now. Someone or something was tapping at her window. Marissa's eyes flicked to the corner of the room where the window was barely visible in the moonlight. The curtains fluttered in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone outside. Still, she could hear the tapping, as though it was getting louder, almost frantic. Her hands shook as she grabbed the flashlight beside her bed. Slowly, she walked toward the window, her feet almost making no sound as they touched the floor. And then, she stopped. There, standing at the window, was a face. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes staring directly at her. Its mouth opened wide, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. The tapping was louder now, almost a pounding. Marissa screamed. The figure on the other side of the window stepped back into the shadows, and the sound of tapping stopped instantly. Marissa didn't sleep that night. She sat up, wide-eyed, her hands clutching the blanket around her as if it could protect her from whatever was outside. She wasn't sure how long she stayed like that, but when the morning light finally came, she felt the weight of exhaustion bear down on her. But it wasn't just the lack of sleep that worried her. It was the silence. When she stepped outside to get some air, she saw something that made her stomach turn. The woods behind her cottage were quiet, unnaturally quiet. But there, just at the edge of the trees, she saw a figure. The same tall, gaunt shape, standing motionless, staring at her. The same shadow she had seen at the window. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure wasn't just watching her, it was waiting for her. And she knew, deep down, that it would never leave her alone. That afternoon, Marissa decided to leave. She packed her things in a hurry, her mind spinning with fear. As she gathered her bags, she heard something, the softest whisper. "You're not leaving." The voice was faint but unmistakable, a cold whisper in her ear. Marissa spun around, but no one was there. The whisper continued, growing louder, until it filled her mind. "You're mine now. You can never leave." Marissa bolted out the door, her legs moving before she could think. She ran toward the town, toward the distant lights, away from the cottage and the woods. But as she turned one last time to look back, she saw it. The figure, standing by the window, watching her leave. And she knew, in that moment, that she was never going to escape. The knocking in the walls. For as long as Emma could remember, she had been fascinated by the old house at the end of Sycamore Lane. She had heard the stories growing up, whispers about the house's strange history, about the old woman who had lived there, and the peculiar noises that came from its walls. Some said the house was cursed, others claimed it was just the wind or the old pipes. But no one really knew. When Emma moved back to the town after years of being away, she had no intention of returning to the house. But, like so many things in life, curiosity got the better of her. The first night she spent in the house was uneventful. It had taken Emma all day to clean up the dust, unpack boxes, and get the place ready. The house was dark and a bit run down, but it had a certain charm. The large windows overlooked the dense woods at the back of the property, and the creaking floors echoed through the hallways, adding to the feeling of being in a place that was both comforting and strange. But as Emma lay in bed that night, her eyes wide open, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was still, too still. The house felt almost alive, as though it was watching her. That was when she heard it. A soft, faint knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the walls, somewhere near the back of the house. She froze, her heart thumping in her chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap. 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 She listened for a few moments, her breath shallow. The knocking continued, and then, suddenly, it stopped. Emma tried to push the thought out of her mind. It was probably just an old house noise. There had to be an explanation. But the knocking had felt too intentional. It lingered in her mind long after she managed to fall asleep. The next day, Emma tried to go about her usual tasks, unpacking and organizing. She avoided the back of the house, the area where the knocking had come from. Every now and then, though, she would hear a faint creak, a scratch against the wall, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. By the evening, Emma was on edge. The knocking had come again, but this time, it was louder. More insistent. Tap. 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 It seemed to be coming from the walls near the kitchen. Her pulse quickened. She didn't want to investigate, but she had to. She needed to know what was making the noise. She walked cautiously toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the cold chill that had settled in her chest. The knocking stopped as she reached the door, and everything was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Emma stepped into the kitchen, her heart racing. The room was dimly lit by the light from the window, and everything seemed to be in place. But something felt off. Her eyes were drawn to the wall. It was an old, cracked plaster wall, worn from years of neglect. But now, as she stared at it, she noticed something new. A small crack had appeared in the wall, right near the baseboard. And from within that crack, there was a faint, dark stain. Emma leaned in closer, her curiosity getting the better of her. The stain looked like it had been there for a while, but there was something unnatural about it. The edges of the stain seemed to move, shifting slowly, as though something was pushing against the wall from the other side. She stepped back, shuddering. The knocking had stopped again, but her skin prickled with unease. She wasn't sure what she was feeling, fear, curiosity, or something else, but she knew one thing for certain: something was wrong with the house. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, the sound of the knocking echoing in her mind. Tap. 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 The knocking seemed to grow louder, as if it was coming from right under her bed. Her heart raced in the silence of the night. She sat up, her breath coming in short gasps, and listened. The knocking was there again, relentless, like a heartbeat inside the walls. This time, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She had to find out what it was. The fear she felt mingled with an overwhelming need to know what was happening in the walls of the house. With a trembling hand, she grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and made her way toward the back of the house. Her feet moved soundlessly across the old wood floors, but the knocking grew louder with every step she took. Tap. 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 She reached the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. The crack in the wall was still there, the stain growing darker. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand in front of it. Her flashlight flickered in her hand. She turned it on, aiming the beam at the wall. The knocking stopped. for a long, unsettling moment, there was only silence. Then, something new happened. The wall began to shake. It was subtle at first, like the house was breathing, but it grew stronger, more violent, until Emma had to steady herself against the door frame to keep from falling. The knocking returned, but now it wasn't just tapping. It was pounding. Hard. Fast. Bang. 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 The walls rattled as if something were trying to break through. The plaster cracked and splintered, and the stain on the wall began to spread. Emma gasped in horror as she saw it long, dark fingers pressing through the crack, reaching toward her. She backed away in terror, stumbling over her feet. Her mind was racing, her heart thudding in her chest as she tried to understand what she was seeing. The fingers were clawing their way through the wall. And then, the voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, its tone distorted and low, like it was coming from deep underground. "Help me out." The voice was pleading, begging. Emma could barely breathe as she stood frozen, her legs shaking beneath her. The fingers continued to stretch through the crack, reaching for her. "Please, help me, before it's too late." In a blind panic, Emma ran from the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. She rushed to the front door, throwing it open and running outside into the pouring rain. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it didn't stop her. She ran down the driveway and into the woods, not stopping until she was far away from the house. She collapsed onto the wet ground, gasping for air, her chest heaving with terror. But when she turned around, her eyes widened in disbelief. The house was no longer there. It had vanished. The dark windows, the crackling walls, the shadowy figures, everything was gone. The spot where the cottage had stood was empty, replaced by a dense forest. The trees were thick, their branches hanging low, their trunks twisting as if they were reaching for her. The next morning, Emma woke up in her car, parked a mile away from the house. The events of the night before seemed like a dream, but the fear still gripped her. She looked around, and there, in the distance, stood the house once more, untouched, as though nothing had ever happened. She never went back. The knocking, the fingers, the voice, they followed her wherever she went. No matter where she lived, what town she moved to, the sound of the knocking would return, louder and more insistent, as if it were searching for her. And deep down, she knew that whatever was in those walls was still waiting for her. The whispering forest. Hannah had never been one to believe in ghosts. She'd spent her whole life in bustling cities, surrounded by noise and people, and had always dismissed any talk of spirits or hauntings as fanciful tales. But that was before she moved to Hollowbrook. Hollowbrook was small, a town barely marked on most maps. Its residents were a quiet bunch, with most of them working the nearby farms or tending to the few shops that lined the main street. The real attraction of the town, however, was the forest that surrounded it. Local legend had it that the forest was haunted, cursed even, though no one ever seemed willing to say exactly why. When Hannah first arrived, she didn't give the stories much thought. The house she rented sat just on the edge of the woods, nestled between tall pines and thick underbrush. It was quaint, isolated, and the perfect place to start fresh. After months of living in busy cities, she welcomed the stillness that surrounded her. The first few days passed without incident. She unpacked her belongings, cleaned the house, and settled into the peaceful rhythm of the town. Each morning, she would take long walks through the woods, enjoying the solitude and the cool, crisp air. The trees whispered softly in the wind, and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush made her feel more connected to nature than she ever had before. But soon, Hannah began to notice something strange. On her walks, she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. After all, she was in a new place, and it was easy to feel paranoid. But the feeling grew stronger each day. The whispers in the trees, the way the birds seemed to go silent when she passed by, it was as though the forest itself was aware of her presence. And then, on the seventh night, it happened. Hannah was sitting in her living room, reading by the soft glow of the lamp, when she heard it. A faint tapping at the window. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she stood up and moved toward the window, her breath shallow. She peeked outside, but there was nothing. Just the dark outline of the trees and the moonlight filtering through the branches. Just the wind, she muttered, brushing off the chill that had settled in her chest. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She returned to her chair, but the uneasy feeling lingered, making her glance toward the window every few minutes. That was when she heard the tapping again. This time, it was louder. Tap. 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 She stood up quickly, her pulse racing. The window was shut tight. Was it a branch tapping against the glass? It couldn't be. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate. She crossed the room to the window again, heart pounding, and this time she flung the curtains open. Nothing. Just the empty night. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure. A dark shadow standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the trees. It was tall, its shape indistinct, but it was there. Watching. Hannah's heart stopped. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again, but the figure was gone. The forest was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. She shook her head, trying to calm herself. It was probably just a trick of the light, she told herself. But the fear was already lodged deep inside her. She couldn't ignore the strange feeling that had crept over her. And when she went to bed that night, she kept the curtains open, her eyes fixed on the woods. The night passed in uneasy silence. The tapping didn't return, but the sense of being watched never left. The following days were strange. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The townspeople were friendly enough, but when she mentioned the figure she'd seen in the woods, they grew strangely silent. Some of the older residents even seemed nervous. "Be careful in the woods, miss," the town's storekeeper, Mrs. Grayson, warned her one afternoon as Hannah paid for a few groceries. "There's things out there that no one understands. Things you don't want to get mixed up with." Hannah frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Grayson's eyes darted around the shop before she leaned in close, lowering her voice. The woods, they don't like strangers. You might be okay, but don't stray too far. And never stay after dark. The woman's warning only unsettled Hannah further, but she brushed it off. She was a grown woman, not some naive child. She wasn't afraid of a few wild stories. But as the days passed, her walks through the woods became less frequent. The whispering in the trees seemed to grow louder, the air thicker. And then, one evening, she heard it again, the tapping. Tap. 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 This time, it was coming from inside the house. Hannah stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was unmistakable. It was as if someone or something was tapping on the walls, on the very frame of the house. She glanced around, her hands shaking as she moved toward the source of the sound. The walls were silent now, but the feeling of being watched was overpowering. She took a few hesitant steps toward the attic door, the one that had always remained locked. Her mind raced, and for the first time since moving in, she questioned whether she should have stayed. But her curiosity overpowered her fear. She had to know what was causing these strange noises. The attic was dark, the air musty. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she made her way toward the far corner of the room. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was just as unsettling. She could feel the presence, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The attic was filled with old furniture boxes, discarded items, and old paintings. But then, near the back, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A door. A small, hidden door tucked away behind a stack of crates. She hadn't seen it before. In fact, she didn't remember it being there at all. Hannah hesitated. The air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping as she moved closer to it. Something inside her screamed to turn around, to leave the house, to run. But her feet carried her forward, and before she knew it, she was standing in front of the door. With trembling hands, she reached for the handle. It turned easily, and as the door creaked open, a cold wind rushed toward her, carrying with it a faint whisper. "It's time." The room beyond the door was small and dark. There were no windows, just thick shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. But then, in the center of the room, she saw it. A mirror. It stood there, old and cracked, reflecting only darkness. But when Hannah stepped closer, the mirror seemed to come to life, its surface rippling like water. She didn't know why, but she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the glass, and in an instant, the mirror shattered. The glass fell to the floor with a sharp, echoing crash. And then, the whisper returned. But this time, it wasn't from the walls. It was right behind her. Hannah spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no one there. Only the empty attic. Except for the shadows. The shadows seemed to move, shifting on their own, curling around the edges of the room, growing darker. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw someone. A figure, emerging from the darkness. It was the same tall shape from the window. The figure moved closer, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes, they were glowing, red and hollow, like two pits staring into her soul. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice deep and cold. Now you're mine. Hannah tried to run, but the shadows had already wrapped around her, pulling her toward the figure. With a final, desperate scream, she felt herself being dragged into the dark. And the last thing she heard before everything went black was the soft, rhythmic tapping. The music box. The town of Ashford was quiet, tucked away between the hills and the thick forests that surrounded it. It wasn't the kind of place people visited, unless they had a reason to. There were no grand attractions, no bustling streets, just old houses, a few shops, and a small population that had lived there for generations. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been frozen in time. Cassie had arrived in Ashford on a whim. She had been driving across the country, trying to escape the memories of a life that had been too loud, too painful. She didn't know why she'd picked Ashford. Maybe it was the faded postcard she had found at a rest stop, showing the small town surrounded by woods. She decided to stop for the night, to take a break before continuing her journey. Little did she know, it was the kind of stop that would change everything. The bed and breakfast she found was an old, two-story house on the outskirts of town. It looked like something from a different era, with ivy creeping up its stone walls and a porch that seemed to groan under the weight of age. When Cassie knocked, the door opened slowly, revealing the innkeeper, a tall woman with graying hair and a kind, but tired expression. "Welcome, dear. You must be exhausted. Come in, I'll show you to your room," the innkeeper said, her voice soft and warm. Cassie smiled politely, not quite sure what to make of the strange sense of familiarity that washed over her. The house felt oddly comforting, as though it were a place she had been before, even though she knew it was her first time here. The room she was given was small, with a single window that overlooked the woods behind the house. It was cozy, with a large bed, a wooden desk, and an antique dresser. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and the soft ticking of an old clock filled the silence. She unpacked, feeling the fatigue of the road settle into her bones, and decided to take a walk around town before it got too late. Ashford was peaceful, too quiet even, with only the occasional car passing by. The town square was empty, save for a small group of elderly people sitting on a bench, chatting softly. The shops were closed, their windows dark. Cassie wandered through the streets until she came across an old shop at the end of the street. Its sign was barely visible, its letters faded and chipped. The door creaked as she stepped inside, greeted by the smell of dust and antique furniture. The shop was cluttered with old books, paintings, and strange knickknacks. But what caught her eye was a small wooden music box sitting on the counter. It was intricately carved, with delicate patterns swirling around its edges, but there was something unsettling about it. It was as if it was calling to her. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, noticed her interest. "Ah, I see you found it," he said in a raspy voice. "That's a special piece. Came from the old house down the road, the one with the ivy on it. They say it's been in the family for generations." Cassie's heart skipped a beat. The house down the road. The innkeeper had mentioned a house like that when she arrived. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed odd that it would be connected to the music box. The shopkeeper noticed the curious look on her face. Not many people buy that one, he continued, leaning in closer. Well, it's said to have a history, a story of its own. But that's for another time. Cassie was intrigued but also hesitant. How much is it? Just a few dollars. I can tell it's caught your attention. But, be warned, things like this, they have a way of keeping hold of people. That night, as Cassie lay in bed, the music box was on the nightstand next to her. She hadn't meant to bring it upstairs, but something had drawn her to it. She couldn't quite explain it. The box was small, beautiful, and delicate, and she found herself fascinated by the craftsmanship. The carvings on the sides were intricate, as though they told a story, but no matter how hard she stared, she couldn't quite make out what it was. Cassie reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. She turned the key, and a soft, haunting melody filled the room. It was faint, but beautiful, and it made her feel an odd sense of calm. She closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, and for a moment, she forgot about everything: the road, the town, her past. She felt at peace. But as the song played, a shadow seemed to fall across the room. At first, she thought it was just the flicker of the candle light, but then the air grew colder. The room seemed darker, despite the warm glow of the lamp beside her. The melody stopped suddenly. Cassie opened her eyes and stared at the music box. It was still, the lid closed tightly, but a chill ran down her spine. She was sure the song had been playing for much longer. And for a brief, unsettling moment, she thought she saw something moving in the corner of the room. She blinked, and the movement was gone. The next day, Cassie tried to shake off the feeling of unease. She decided to spend the day exploring the woods behind the house. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead like sentinels. It felt like the woods went on forever, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves creating an eerie but soothing atmosphere. But as she wandered deeper, she began to feel the same sense of being watched that she had felt the night before. She turned, half expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one. It was then that she noticed something strange: an old path leading through the trees, hidden beneath thick vines. It seemed out of place, as though it had been untouched for years. Without thinking, she stepped onto the path, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the dense underbrush. The path twisted and turned, leading her further into the woods, and as she walked, the air grew colder. There was a heaviness to the air, a quiet, almost oppressive stillness. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper with each step. Then, ahead of her, she saw it. An old, crumbling house exactly like the one the innkeeper had mentioned. The ivy had overtaken much of the building, but it was still standing, its windows dark and lifeless. The house seemed to draw her in, as if it were calling her to come closer. She hesitated, but something inside her urged her to move forward. As she approached the house, she could feel the temperature drop. It was as if the air itself had thickened. She stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under her weight. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, the air was cold and musty, and dust hung in the air like a veil. The house was full of old furniture, covered in sheets, forgotten by time. It was quiet, too quiet. But then, she heard it. The faint sound of music. It was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. The same haunting melody from the music box. It echoed through the dark rooms, filling the space with an eerie sense of familiarity. Cassie's heart began to race. She followed the sound, her footsteps barely making a sound as she moved through the house. The room seemed to stretch on forever, and the further she went, the louder the music became. It was almost as if the house itself was alive, breathing with the melody. Finally, she found the source. There, on an old mantelpiece, was the music box. The lid was open, and the song was playing louder now, more insistent. But there was something different. As the music played, Cassie noticed something she hadn't seen before. The shadows in the room were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they shifted, like they were alive. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. A figure tall, dark, and gaunt emerged from the shadows. It was standing motionless, staring at her with hollow eyes. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, to run, but her feet wouldn't respond. The figure took a slow step toward her, its face still hidden in the darkness. The air grew colder, the music louder, until it filled her mind, drowning out everything else. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered. And then, everything went black.